Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. An increasing number of humanitarian issues are closely tied to broader political, social, economic, and environmental trends today. Rapid changes in the globalized world are demanding an enhanced capacity to address humanitarian challenges, to save lives, protect human dignity, and promote welfare. You will certainly agree with me that humanitarian challenges cannot be tackled in isolation. A multidisciplinary approach is crucial to solving problems. Not only international humanitarian organizations, governments and non-governmental bodies, but also the private sector, academic institutions and think tanks, as well as civil society and other international organizations, including financial institutions, are all asked to collaborate more efficiently and effectively in very short term. For this, we need new solutions. This humanitarian forum provides a unique multi-stakeholder platform which should help us promote dialogue, forge new partnerships, and move the global humanitarian agenda ahead. And we are deeply thankful to Kofi Annan for this forum. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is one of the most significant humanitarian concerns emerging today. In its first report nearly 20 years ago, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change mentioned climate change as a likely cause of migration problems. Today, this is reality. Climate change increases existing ecological, economic, political, social, and health risks, and its biggest impact is on countries and population groups already exposed to high level of risks. In the past few years, scientists have built up a considerable body of knowledge on the subject of climate change. Slowly, from statistics and graphs, we see human faces emerging and stories that reveal its impact on people. A woman in Burkina Faso who is no longer able to cultivate her field as a result of desertification. A farmer in the Mekong Delta who sells his daughter to a human trafficker for the money to buy new seed to replace what was washed away by floodwaters. A homeless family in Myanmar that lost all its possessions in the cyclone. These stories show the real cost of climate change and are typical of many who see migration as the only way out. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change, loss of biodiversity, conflicts over increasingly scarce resources, this ecological and social crisis above all, make one thing clear. The bonfire of resources that made possible the development of countries in the north cannot be repeated, especially not with a world population that is already enormous and still growing. 25% of the world's population consumes 75% of its resources. This general rule is still true. Environmental crises show in a drastic way the conflict between economic expansion with its demands on natural resources and ecological limits. The global environmental space is finite. The risks that arise from global warming fall on the weakest member of society who already survive on the bare minimum. The poorest in our world are particularly vulnerable to environmental deterioration. They are exposed to risks that threaten their very existence, including poor harvests, sickness and hunger, and they have little or no possibility of adapting. The more scarce the natural resources, the more urgent the question of their distribution and the question of equity becomes. Any decision on what is to be considered a dangerous of impact is a political and ethical issue. What right has each country to what nature can offer and to what extent? How much can any country take for his well-being? Ladies and gentlemen, more than 60 years ago, the United Nations proclaimed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. In a globalized world, it is increasingly the discourse of human rights that sets the terms of reference for disputes over power and its victims. Climate change has a critical significance for the well-being and dignity of every person, and it is a striking example for the transnational character of threats in our world. They surpass the jurisdiction of single states. It is therefore very crucial to share the environmental global space among all world citizens and to take into account the future generations as well. From a human rights perspective, fundamental rights should have priority over demands for a higher standard of living in the North as well as in the South. This is particularly applicable to climate policy, which determines the amount of the global environment that will remain available for the poor countries, the extent to which emissions will affect poor countries and population groups, and the extent to which poor population groups have access to resources. Climate change is one of the most significant humanitarian concerns. It is also primarily a human rights issue. We will know that it is not possible for we all know that it is not possible for 7 billion people to enjoy a Western style of life. There can be no replacement for planet Earth. The only solution is to change our ways of thinking, technology, science, policies, and above all, our economies. Ladies and gentlemen, developing a climate policy based on the principle of fairness and a better relationship with nature is one of the critical tasks which the international community must face. Our generations will be measured by how we address these challenges. But we are hampered by the deep-rooted lack of trust, a lack of trust between the industrialized and developing countries. Many industrialized countries believe that the development countries are doing too little and applying undue pressure. Many developing countries believe that the industrialized countries have defaulted on the engagement of financial and technological assistance. They see little long-term responsibility. They claim that the rich countries have filled the atmosphere with emissions from hydrocarbons, with which they have fueled their own development. A post-Kyoto regime must be equitable, workable, and take into account very different national circumstances. It must give strength and teeth to the notion of common, but nevertheless different responsibilities. And it must be accepted that climate-friendly solutions be adopted in a multitude of policy areas, including transport, construction, agriculture, and so on. It must also extend to foreign policy, development policy, and international security policy. Then when it comes to climate, the nations of the world are linked. Environmental and resources crises spill over territorial borders. This alters the fundamental of foreign policy. While a proper understanding of what is in the national interest will of course remain the basis for foreign policy action, today that action must be linked to the well-being of all world citizens and the respect of a global common. That means assuming an equal right to the Earth's atmosphere.